Christopher Columbus, the man and the myth. Christopher Columbus is one of the best-known personages from any period of history. Most places in the United States, such as cities, universities, streets, have been named after him more than anyone else except for George Washington. Yet his life is shrouded in mystery and is the subject of sharp, often acrimonious debate. How can that be? Everyone knows that in 1492, Columbus sailed to what we now call America. And everyone agrees that the 4 voyages of discovery irreversibly changed the course of history. But that's just about where agreement on Columbus ends. The history of Columbus is hard to piece together and even harder to evaluate. And drawing an accurate profile of the man has been made even more difficult by the numerous myths that surround him. For example, one of the best-known stories about Columbus is that Isabella, Queen of Spain, pawned her crown jewels to finance Columbus's voyage. That never happened. Isabella may have offered to pawn her jewels. Scholars are not certain. But even if she did, it was not necessary. The first voyage of Columbus was financed from private sources and by juggling the royal finances. A second myth: the crew of Columbus's first voyage was composed mainly of criminals. In fact, of the 90 men aboard the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria, just 4 were criminals, and they happened to be experienced seamen. One of those 4 had killed a man in a fight and had been sentenced to death. The other 3 rescued the condemned man from jail, a crime for which they too received the death sentence. While at large, the 4 took advantage of a royal decree pardoning anyone who would sail with Columbus. According to Samuel Eliot Morison, author of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the preeminent biography of Columbus, the royal order suspending all civil and criminal processes against men who signed on with Columbus gave rise to the notion, repeated ad nauseum, that Columbus's crew were composed of desperate characters, criminals, and jailbirds. Even these 4 were not in the ordinary sense jailbirds, and at least 3 of them made good. Yet another myth. Columbus spent 6 or 7 years in Spain trying to get royal sponsorship for his voyage. During that time, the myth goes, he was the target of the jests and pointed remarks of those who did not believe his voyage was possible. Columbus, it is popularly believed, argued that the world was round, while those who opposed his voyage thought it was flat. This myth derives from Washington Irving's enormously popular 1828 biography, The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. Irving creates a vivid scene of an obscure navigator facing a royal commission of scholars and theologians in Salamanca, Spain, convened to judge his proposal for a voyage of discovery. Columbus argued his case but was turned down, largely because he could not convince his distinguished panel that the world was round. Writes Irving, before this erudite assembly, Columbus presented himself to propound and defend his conclusions. He had been scoffed at as a visionary by the vulgar and the ignorant, but he was convinced that he only required a body of enlightened men to listen dispassionately to his reasonings to ensure triumphant conviction. What a striking spectacle must the hall of the old convent have presented at this memorable conference. A simple mariner standing forth in the midst of an imposing array of professors, friars, and dignitaries of the church, maintaining his theory with natural eloquence and, as it were, pleading the cause of the New World. At the very threshold of the discussion, instead of geographical objections, Columbus was assailed with citations from the Bible and the Testament, the book of Genesis, the Psalms of David, the prophets, the epistles, and the Gospels. Doctrinal points were mixed up with philosophical discussions, and a mathematical demonstration was allowed no weight if it appeared to clash with the text of Scripture. In the end, the commission scoffed at the idea of the roundness of the earth. This deeply moving scene, written by Irving, has influenced many and was instrumental in defining Columbus in the popular imagination. Here, Columbus, the spokesman for rational scientific thought, was opposed by the superstitious religious establishment of his day, at the heart of the debate whether the world was flat or round. Morrison wrote, "This gripping drama has become one of the most popular Columbian myths, for we all love to hear of professors and experts being confounded by simple common sense." Well, there are at least three major problems with Irving's story. First, by the time Columbus arrived in Spain, he was no obscure navigator. Second, although a commission had been convened to study Columbus's proposal, the meeting Irving described never took place. Third, no educated person in the 15th century believed the world was flat. All, including the members of the commission, knew very well the world was round. As Morrison put it, Irving's story was pure moonshine and mischievous nonsense. But that did not stop it from being retold in textbooks and encyclopedias even to the present day. The recent movie Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, recycled a number of other myths about Columbus. For example, it is well known that Columbus had trouble with his crew. In the log of his first voyage, Columbus said the crew complained about the length of the voyage. By the time Columbus's son Fernando described the voyage in his biography of his father, the story had progressed. The crewmen were near mutiny as the voyage got longer and longer. Fearful they would never return home, they talked about throwing Columbus overboard at night and sailing back. But in the movie, when the men became mutinous, Columbus ordered the crew to cut off his head if they did not find land in 3 days. More moonshine. Myths like these obscure our understanding of Columbus's life, but they are relatively minor compared to the larger issues. Was Columbus a discoverer or a conqueror? A rationalist or a mystic? A capitalist or a visionary? Was he supremely arrogant or motivated by a noble cause? Or was he just the luckiest man in history, a hard-headed sailor who stumbled across America? Or was he divinely guided? Did he inaugurate an age of progress and enlightenment? Or did he unleash destructive forces that now threaten the survival of Earth? To separate the man from the myth, we must first define the man. What made him, what he tried to do, what he actually accomplished. And this is where our troubles begin. Because Columbus, to borrow a line from Winston Churchill, is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Maybe he planned it that way. Scholars, historians, and writers of varying degrees of skill and objectivity have argued that Columbus was Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Scandinavian, Swiss, Greek, Catalonian, Armenian, Russian, Majorcan, Basque, Croatian, and even Chinese. Some say he was a Spanish Jew, or that he came from a family of conversos, Jews who converted to Catholicism. Still others say he was a French pirate in the service of René d'Anjou, or a spy for King John II of Portugal, or even an agent of a secret society guarding the descendants of Jesus. More than 250 scholarly books and articles have been written on the origins of Columbus, but no one knows for certain where Columbus was born or his date of birth. No one even knows exactly what he looked like. Fernando said his father was a well-built man of more than average stature, the face long, the cheeks somewhat high, his body neither fat nor lean. He had an aquiline nose and light-colored eyes. His complexion was light and tending to bright red. In youth, his hair was blonde, but when he reached the age of 30, it all turned white. Other reports by his contemporaries agree, but no one painted a portrait of Columbus during his life. According to William and Carla Phillips, authors of The Worlds of Christopher Columbus, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago displayed 71 portraits reputedly of Columbus, none that could claim to have been painted in his life, and most of them bearing no resemblance whatsoever to contemporary descriptions of him. Most scholars are certain Columbus came from Genoa. There is good evidence to support this case, but not good enough to lay the other claims to rest. The Columbus came from Genoa theory is the basis for the standard Columbus biography. It goes like this. The man we know as Christopher Columbus was born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa in 1451. Scholars working from notarized legal documents have concluded that he was born sometime between August 25th and October 31st. His father, Domenico, was a wool weaver, and his mother, Susanna, was the daughter of a wool weaver. Columbus was the eldest of 5 children. One brother, Bartholomew, became an active collaborator with him in all his projects. Another brother, Diego, sailed with Columbus on his second voyage and helped govern the island of Hispaniola. Christopher became a wool worker and worked in his father's shop, but he also began sailing when he was young. How young, we do not know. Columbus wrote that he went to sea at a tender age, but doesn't give the age. Fernando says he was 14. Yet it is not clear how he divided his time between sailing and wool working. When Columbus was about 21 years old, he still described himself as a wool worker, not as a sailor. But within 2 decades, about half of which he spent on land, he had become one of the greatest mariners of all time. Columbus had little or no formal education. Scholars suppose that whatever education he received was at a primitive school set up by Genoese wool workers. But Columbus was very well educated. He was well read, a prolific letter writer, and an engaging and persuasive speaker. By the time he was 30, he had become a merchant, a bookseller, and a map maker. Genoa is located on the Mediterranean Sea in Italy. In the time of Columbus, it was an independent city-state. It was a maritime power and was becoming a metropolis of European capitalism. Genoa sent ships throughout the Mediterranean to trade. It had established an economic empire. According to the standard biography, Columbus was typically Genoese, steeped in both the lore of the sea and in commerce. Paolo Emilio Taviani, formerly a professor at the University of Genoa and one of Europe's leading authorities on Columbus, wrote, Columbus's Genoese cultural roots, clearly and unequivocally evident in trade and economics, are also evident in another related field, geography. Genoa in the 15th century was already one of the capitals of nautical cartography. As a boy at the school of the Wool Merchants Guild, Christopher learned the first elements of geography and of navigation. Genoa was the birthplace of the discoverer of the Americas and his cultural homeland. From Genoa, Columbus inherited his basic character and faith, his knowledge of the sea, as well as his scientific curiosity and economic initiative. End of quote by Taviani. The sea obviously played a big role in Columbus's life. His early voyages were probably brief coastal trading excursions. In 1474 or 1475, Columbus made a longer voyage to Chios, an island in the Aegean Sea under Genoese control. In 1476, Columbus moved to Portugal, where he lived for 7 or 8 years. In Portugal, Columbus made a series of voyages that gave him vital sailing experience. Between 1476 and 1477, Columbus sailed to England, Ireland, and even to Iceland. In 1478, he went on a sugar-buying trip from Lisbon to Madeira, an island 560 miles from Portugal off the coast of Africa. And sometime between 1481 and 1484, Columbus sailed once, perhaps twice, to Guinea on the coast of Africa, where Portugal had a trading post. In 1478 or 1479, Columbus married Filipa Perestreo Moines, a Portuguese noblewoman. Their son, Diego, was born in 1480. While in Portugal, Columbus conceived of his great enterprise. Before we go any further, let us stop and consider what Columbus was trying to do. Was he looking for a route to the New World? No, according to the standard biography, which maintains that no one in Europe knew of America's existence. The discoverer of the Americas, as Taviani calls him, was looking for a short route to the Indies. In Columbus's day, the Indies was an all-embracing term for Asia, including China, India, and Japan. All the nations of Europe were trying to establish direct ties to the East. In the 15th century, Europeans knew little about Asia, and what they did know was often wrong or distorted. Asia, in the popular European imagination, assumed mythic proportions as a treasure house of exotic luxuries, gold, jewels, silks, and spices. According to Zvi Dorner, author of Columbus and the Age of Discovery, China, along with the rest of the Far East, was known just well enough to Westerners to exist outside the dimensions of pure legend, yet so poorly understood that every snippet of information about Cathay, China, or Chipango, Japan, or the Indies, the Far East in general, was grasped at eagerly by the princes, merchants, and scholars of Europe. Europe's fascination, perhaps obsession with Asia, had been developing for centuries. Europeans knew about Asia from the days of the Roman Empire, when trading routes stretched from India to Britain. But in the 5th century, the empire disintegrated. Direct trade with Asia ceased, and Europe slipped into a period of intellectual stagnation, ignorance, poverty, and cultural decline, known as the Dark Ages. Even so, Asia lived on in the European mind as a source of luxury and the site of Christianity's terrestrial paradise, the Garden of Eden. The rise of Muslim power in the 7th century prevented Europe from re-establishing direct contact with Asia. Islam spread out from its base on the Arabian Peninsula, dominated North Africa and the Middle East, and blocked the trade routes to the East. Throughout the Dark Ages, that is, from the 5th to the 10th centuries, Europe was attacked by outside invaders. From the north by the Vikings, from the east and south by the Magyars and the Muslims. But by the 10th century, Europe had dealt with its external threats and began to prosper. Late in the 11th century, Pope Urban II initiated the Crusades to liberate Jerusalem, the spiritual center of Christianity, from the Muslims. The Crusades lasted for about 2 centuries and were a military failure. But the Crusaders brought back to Europe direct knowledge of the Middle East and a sense that Asia was truly vast. They also brought back valuable Asian spices, peppers, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and sugar, which was classified as a spice. Dorner points out that these and other spices of the East brought a new savor and variety to a diet made up largely of bread and gruel, cabbage and turnips, and meat that was either heavily salted or rancid from lack of refrigeration. Spices were also used as preservatives, drugs, and medicines. In addition, the Crusaders brought back Asian silks, gums and resins for glue, medicines, ingredients for dyes and perfumes, gold and carved ivory and jade. This only intensified European desires for the goods of the East, but the Muslim world still prevented Europeans from making direct contact with Asia. The door to the East finally opened in the 13th century. The Mongols under Genghis Khan swept across Asia and extended Mongol power from China to Europe. They established a Pax Mongolica and allowed a high degree of contact between Europe and Asia. For the first time in centuries, Europeans were able to travel the ancient Silk Road that stretched from the Middle East to Beijing. Only a few Europeans actually visited Asia. The most famous was the Venetian traveler, as you know, Marco Polo. He spent about 20 years from 1272 to 1292 in Asia, most of it in China, at the court of Kublai Khan, who would later be known in Europe as the Great Khan. Polo's account, The Travels of Marco Polo, was widely read in Europe and inspired many, including Columbus. Polo portrayed the East as a place of untold wealth and the Great Khan as a wealthy and powerful ruler. According to William and Carla Phillips, even 2 centuries after Polo had returned to Italy, his wondrous stories of life in the Mongol court and the fabulous riches of Asia continued to bedazzle Europeans. During the Pax Mongolica, long-distance trade began to develop between Europe and Asia. But in the middle of the 14th century, it was disrupted by 3 factors. The first was the plague, or Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347. It came from Asia across the caravan routes and spread throughout Europe, where it killed 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population of Europe. Then in 1368, the Chinese Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols and reversed their policy of toleration of outsiders. About the same time, the Ottoman Turks established an empire in the Middle East. They seized control of the lucrative trade routes and once again formed a barrier between Europe and Asia. From that point on, Christian Europe had to buy Asian goods on unfavorable terms from Muslim middlemen. By Columbus' time, the European drive to breach or circumvent the Muslim barrier to Asia had increased. Europe wanted to share in the great wealth of the Orient and gain direct access to spices and other luxuries. And European economies were growing, increasing the demand for trade. Europe wanted access to the East for religious reasons too. During the Pax Mongolica, European missionaries investigated ways of converting the huge populations of Asia to Christianity. They were spurred on partly by Kublai Khan's request to the Pope to send missionaries to China, and partly by their missionary zeal. Finally, Europe wanted contact with the East for geopolitical reasons. Europe was isolated on the far western reaches of the Eurasian landmass, and it was blocked in all directions. To the northwest by the frigid Atlantic and contrary winds, to the east by the Muslims, to the south by winds that made it possible to explore Africa, but difficult to get back, and to the west by the Atlantic Ocean. European princes and popes wanted to outflank the Muslim world and form alliances with powerful Asian rulers. They were also spurred on by a curious legend about a Christian Oriental king named Prester John. European rulers thought that if they could find Prester John, he could aid them, perhaps by opening up a second front against the Muslims. The drive to reach Asia intensified in 1453, when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, the center of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Empire. The Ottomans deprived Genoa and Venice of their commercial and colonial interests in the Black and Aegean Seas, making goods from the East even more expensive. According to William and Carla Phillips, for Christian Europe as a whole, the loss of Constantinople meant that the Ottomans held a dagger at the heart of Christian civilization. Thus, Europe was driven to find a new route to the Indies by economics, religion, and geopolitics. Portugal led the way in maritime exploration. It sent ships down the African coast looking for a way around Africa. But to Columbus, this was decidedly a mistake. The voyage was too long. According to scholars, Columbus wanted to find a short route to the Indies. His plan was to sail west to reach the east. Sailing west to find the Indies was a radical idea. It was also wrong. Instead of finding the Indies, Columbus stumbled upon the Americas. It was, according to those who subscribe to the standard biography, a kind of magnificent blunder. Yet there were remarkable side effects of this error. The first voyage of Columbus opened the Atlantic Ocean to exploration. Before Columbus, no one knew how to cross the Atlantic and return. It was Columbus who first intuited and then demonstrated that there was a huge circular clockwise system of winds and currents in the Western Hemisphere that sailors could use to cross the ocean in one direction and to return in another. He recognized that the winds and currents near the equator would take a ship westward, and by traveling to a higher latitude, the same ship could find winds and currents flowing east. This grand intuition was a key component of his great enterprise. In the 15th century, the Atlantic was an impassable barrier known as the Sea of Darkness. A 12th century Arab geographer expressed the feelings of many 15th century sailors about the Atlantic when he wrote, "No one knows what is in that sea because of many obstacles to navigation, profound darkness, high waves, frequent storms, innumerable monsters which people it, and violent winds. No sailor dares penetrate it. They limit themselves to sailing along the coasts without losing sight of land." But the Atlantic did not deter Columbus at all. Why? Why was he not deterred? He was in fact adamant that he could reach the Indies. In fact, one of the outstanding features of Columbus's character was his single-minded persistence. He clung to his belief that he could find the Indies, that he could find them by sailing west, and that he could get there and get back to Europe. His discovery enabled sailors to navigate all of the oceans, not just the Atlantic. According to Michael Bradley, author of The Columbus Conspiracy, what changed the world was that Columbus's discovery, his key, worked not only on the Atlantic, but also on every ocean in the world. All have basically circular wind and current systems which flow westward near the equator and eastward near each pole. The only complication, and one rapidly grasped by mariners, was that the system is clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern. Once that fact was realized, which took only a few short years, the entire world lay open to European exploration and exploitation.
You're watching Elizabeth Clare Prophet, world-renowned author and founder of Summit University. Summit University is located at the beautiful Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana, just north of Yellowstone National Park. If you'd like more information, call 800-323-5228. That's 800-323-5228.
How did Columbus first get the idea of sailing west to the east? No one knows but Christopher Columbus. Nor do they know when he got the idea. Columbus was secretive by nature and never told anyone. His son Fernando says that Columbus did not wish to reveal all the details of his plan, lest it be stolen from him. And according to Taviani, it was Columbus's practice never to tell everything to everyone, but rather to say one thing to one man, something else to another, to reveal only portions of arguments, clues, evidence accumulated over the years in his mind. If you meditate on the mind of Christopher Columbus, which is like an open book before us in this moment, because we're all so focused intently on that mind, what you get, or what I get, is that he never ceased thinking, waking and sleeping, about this one mission, this one goal, this reason for being, this reason that he was born. He thought about it, prayed about it, studied about it, talked to people about it, investigated here and there. It was his all-consuming passion. Scholars aren't even sure why someone else did not sail west first. In The Mysterious History of Columbus, John Wilford asks, why was it Columbus and not someone else who seized upon the idea and pursued it with such tenacity? Of all the questions about Columbus, this is the most important and the most mystifying. Scholars believe that Columbus developed his plan to sail to the Indies sometime during his sojourn in Portugal. That, according to William and Carla Phillips, was arguably the most formative period of his life. But historians simply do not know how the idea came to him. Some argue the plan came from intuition, others that he formulated it from reading and study. Still others have concluded that Columbus used maps and written sources only to support his conclusions. This last position seems to be backed up by Columbus's own words. In 1501, he wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, "For the execution of the journey to the Indies, I was not aided by intelligence, by mathematics, or by maps. It was simply the fulfillment of what Isaiah had prophesied." Columbus was a deeply religious man, but with few exceptions, scholars have minimized the importance of, or completely dismissed, his religious life. Some saw Columbus as a man of action and were more interested in his seamanship. Others thought of his mystical impulses as a progressive form of disease-induced madness that did need not to be taken seriously. Scholars often said that they did not doubt the importance of his spiritual life, but then they promptly ignored it, or branded the most conspicuous record of it, Columbus's Book of Prophecies, as the product of visionary fancies and mental hallucinations. Scholar Henry Vigneaud, while acknowledging that divine inspiration played a part in Columbus's grand design, concluded that since it permits no critical discussion, we need not enter it. In 1985, Pauline Moffett Watts, author of a groundbreaking study on the spiritual origins of Columbus's enterprise of the Indies, wrote, "None of the well-known 19th and 20th century Columbus scholars took seriously the possibility that Columbus's personal spirituality, or the spirituality of his age, might also have inspired him to undertake his voyages of discovery." Later in my lecture, I will present evidence showing that Columbus's spirituality was vital to his grand design. But first, let's review the standard sources of Columbus's plan. From the available information, it appears that Columbus approached the problem of the Indies much like a modern detective. He looked for and sometimes stumbled on clues. He studied maps, consulted experts, made deductions, and came up with a plan. And by fate or design, he found himself in Portugal. In the late 15th century, Portugal was the best of all possible places for Columbus to do research, or what we would call a feasibility study for his voyage. Portugal was then the world's leader in maritime exploration. By sailing out of Portugal, Columbus had access to the best available information on ocean travel, trade, and exploration. And by working as a map maker in Lisbon, he would have been aware of the latest developments in cartography and ocean discovery. In fact, Taviani says the Atlantic itself was the womb of the grand design, the mother of the plan. Columbus's voyages to England, Ireland, Iceland, and Africa gave him the opportunity to master sailing the Atlantic. They also gave him the opportunity to study the patterns of the winds and currents. The Vikings had sailed to North America starting at about 1000 AD. Historians think they visited Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia, but did not colonize the region. Taviani says that it is possible that in 1477, while in Ireland, Columbus may have heard stories about Vineland, the Norse term for the North American coast. Morrison dismissed that possibility, but he wondered if by the time Columbus had reached Iceland, the great enterprise was already simmering in his active brain. I have no doubt that it was. Here, Taviani and Morrison agree. Taviani says it was in Iceland that the first inkling that Asia lay beyond the ocean began to germinate and take on consistency in Columbus's mind. Taviani believes that by the time Columbus was in Icelandic waters, he was already acting as an explorer. Every action that Columbus took thereafter was to fulfill his grand design. During and between his voyages, Columbus came across a number of concrete physical clues that suggested the existence of an advanced civilization to the west of Europe. For example, Columbus talked to people who fished pieces of finely carved wood out of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from shore. In addition, King John II of Portugal showed Columbus pieces of bamboo-like cane that did not grow in Europe. According to Fernando, Columbus was sure the cane had blown across the Atlantic to Portugal from India, or some island in the west. Columbus also saw 2 non-European corpses in the ocean off Galway, Ireland. In the margin of one of his books, he wrote, "Men of Cathay, which is toward the Orient, have come hither. We have seen many remarkable things, especially in Galway of Ireland, a man and a woman of extraordinary appearance, in 2 boats adrift." Let us now turn our attention to maps. Bartholomew Perestrello, Columbus's father-in-law, was a seaman of sorts with a yearning for ocean discovery. Henry the Navigator, Prince of Portugal, had made him the hereditary governor of the island of Porto Santo in the Madeiras. Perestrello had died 20 years before Columbus arrived in Portugal. But his wife, Columbus's mother-in-law, had his maps and his nautical charts. One day, Columbus's mother-in-law was telling him of her late husband's voyages. According to Fernando, when she saw that Columbus was keenly interested in these stories, she gave him her husband's maps and writings on oceanic exploration. Fernando said, "These things excited the admiral," as he called his father, still more, and he informed himself of the other voyages and navigations that the Portuguese were then making to Mina and down the coast of Guinea, and greatly enjoyed speaking with the men who sailed in those regions. One thing leading to another and starting a train of thought, the admiral, while in Portugal, began to speculate that if the Portuguese could sail so far south, it should be possible to sail as far westward, and that it was logical to expect to find land in that direction. End of quote from his son, Fernando. We don't know what kind of maps Columbus got from his mother-in-law. We do know Columbus saw a map of the world drawn by Paolo Toscanelli, a Florentine physician and cartographer. According to Fernando, Toscanelli's map played a large part in encouraging him to undertake his voyage. Toscanelli may have been the first to argue that the shortest way to the east was by sailing west. On June 25, 1474, he sent a letter and a map showing a sea route to the Indies to Portugal's King Alfonso V. This is a reconstruction of a portion of Toscanelli's map. Toscanelli said that one could reach China from Portugal by sailing 5,000 miles, stopping along the way at the island of Antilla and Japan. Antilla is one of a number of mythical islands 15th century geographers thought were real. It is obvious from his letter that Toscanelli had read and absorbed the travels of Marco Polo. He had also incorporated Polo's concept of the size of Asia into his map. Toscanelli's map does not show the Americas. In the 15th century worldview, there were only 3 inhabited land masses: Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they were surrounded by ocean. Thus, according to the knowledge of the day, there was nothing but ocean between the western shores of Europe and the eastern shores of Asia. The question was, how much ocean? Most 15th century geographers based their maps on Ptolemy's 2nd century map of the world. Toscanelli was one of the few who relied on Marco Polo's report that the edge of Asia extended farther to the east, that is, closer to Europe, than Ptolemy said it did. That interested Columbus because the closer Asia was to Europe, the easier it would be to sail there. Columbus and Toscanelli may have exchanged letters, Columbus telling the geographer of his desire to sail to the Indies, Toscanelli sending the future explorer a copy of the letter and map he sent to the king. Whether that correspondence actually took place has occasioned no small controversy, but it really doesn't matter. Columbus undoubtedly read the letter Toscanelli sent to the king and saw the map. In fact, Morrison said that Columbus used the letter as Exhibit A when making his case in Spain. However, Morrison said the letter did not give Columbus his big idea or his sailing directions. It simply gave him highbrow backing when he wanted it badly. Likewise, Taviani concluded that by the time Columbus saw Toscanelli's letter, he already had a clean conception of his grand design. In addition to studying maps, Columbus consulted numerous authorities, including Aristotle, Seneca, and Pierre d'Ailly, author of the medieval classic on geography, Imago Mundi. These authorities enabled Columbus to come up with a set of figures that showed it was feasible to sail west to the Indies. For example, a degree of longitude at the equator is 69.4 miles. The best guess in Columbus's day was somewhere around 60 miles. Columbus chose the estimate of the medieval Arab cosmologist Al-Farghani, which was 56 2/3 Arabic miles. According to Donner, Columbus further reduced the size of the degree of longitude by using Roman rather than Arabic miles. He said, when Columbus, for whatever reason, plugged Roman rather than Arabic miles into Al-Farghani's estimate, he came up with only 45 miles per degree at the equator, or only 40 miles at the more northerly latitude he planned to sail. Columbus's calculations allowed him to argue that the world was much smaller than generally accepted in his time, and that Asia was much larger. By making the world smaller and Asia bigger, Columbus decreased the size of the ocean between Europe and Asia to the point that his venture was feasible. John Wilford, author of The Mysterious History of Columbus, explains, Columbus estimated the circumference of the Earth to be 10% smaller than Ptolemy had reckoned and 25% smaller than it actually is. Not until the 18th century would scientists and surveyors be able to arrive at a sure knowledge as to the length of a degree of longitude. The distance between the Canary Islands, a Spanish possession about 200 miles off the coast of Africa, and Japan was a key measurement. The Canaries were the takeoff point for the 1492 voyage. Japan, one possible destination. The real distance between the two is 10,600 nautical miles. Columbus's calculations put Japan just 2,400 nautical miles from the Canaries. That was well within the range of a caravel and just short of where the Bahamas happened to be. Writes Wilford, armed with these miscalculations and consumed by ambition, Columbus took his case to the court of Portugal, probably in late 1483 or the beginning of 1484. He had reason to hope that John II, knowledgeable in oceanic exploration and eager to extend Portugal's global reach, would be receptive. We don't know with any certainty what happened when Columbus met with the king, but we do know that the king turned him down. Morrison suggested that a committee of the king's advisors put up good solid arguments like this. Unfortunately, Captain Colombo, we deny the validity of your calculation of the globe. We suspect the accuracy of your compatriot Marco Polo. We doubt the existence of his Chipango. Ptolemy mentioned no such place. According to the close calculations of our mathematical experts, it would be necessary to sail at least 10,000 nautical miles due west before reaching Cattigara, the eastern verge of the known world. Even assuming that you find favorable winds over that vast expanse of ocean, which we strongly doubt, and that you can sail an average of 4 knots, which is what our best caravels can do on long voyages, your passage would require 100 days, over 14 weeks beyond sight of land. We should not feel justified in risking the money of the King our Lord, whom God preserve, or the lives of his subjects on so dubious an enterprise. You may go. End of quote. A Portuguese historian writing sometime between 1539 and 1552 described Columbus at the meeting as a man expert, eloquent, and good Latinist, and very boastful in his affairs. He said Columbus asked the king for vessels to go and discover the Isle Chipango, that is, Japan. According to Fernando, the king was deeply impressed by Columbus's presentation. But on the advice of a trusted aide, the king double-crossed Columbus and decided to send the caravels secretly to attempt what the admiral had offered to do, to avoid paying Columbus the rewards he demanded. According to Fernando, that angered Columbus, and he was off to Spain with his son Diego. His wife Felipa had previously died, when or how we do not know. Before we leave this subject, there is one more point to consider. Why was Columbus so sure of himself? His certainty has led some historians to conclude he had stumbled upon a secret while he was in Portugal. Did he have definite information about lands to the west? According to one school of thought, the answer is yes. Shortly after his great discovery, a story began to circulate that Columbus had first-hand information about what he called the Indies and we call the Americas. The gist of the story is that a caravel sailing from Spain to England was blown off course and ended up in the islands Columbus sailed to in 1492. The ship eventually returned to Europe, although everyone but the pilot, who happened to be an intimate friend of Columbus, and several crew members died along the way. The survivors were in bad shape and died soon after they returned. But before he died, the pilot told Columbus where he had been and gave him the information he needed to make the map. This was done with the greatest of secrecy. According to William and Carla Phillips, another variant of the story assumes that Columbus himself had already been across the ocean and later sought backing merely to secure a proprietary claim to what he had already discovered. But they say, such stories are always used to deny Columbus and his 1492 voyage the importance that history has traditionally accorded them. That may be true. However, in 1494, Ferdinand and Isabella wrote a letter to Columbus, which suggested that maybe he had been to the Americas before 1492, or that he had talked to someone who had. The king and queen wrote, "It seems to us that all which at the beginning you told us that you could find has for the greater part been true, as if you had seen it before you spoke to us." End of the quote from the letter. All who believe that Columbus knew where he was going, please stand up. Maybe you were there. Were you the islanders or were you his crew? Well, you were all there to welcome him, right? We know that Columbus picked a nearly perfect path to sail from Spain to the Bahamas, and that he sailed north and picked a nearly perfect path back to Europe. He also seemed to know just how far his destination was. According to Fernando, Columbus told his crew not to expect to find land until they had gone 750 leagues from the Canaries, just about the distance of the first landfall. Does that mean Columbus had been to America? The only person who knew for certain was Columbus, and he wasn't talking. But Las Casas was certain that Columbus knew just where he was going and just what he was going to find. He wrote, "Columbus was as sure as if he had already been there in person. I myself have no doubt about his certainty." He also wrote, "He was as sure he would discover what he did discover and find what he did find as if he held it in a chamber under lock and key." I would like to read to you Columbus's own description of why he made his voyage. In a letter, Columbus described his background as follows: "At a very early age, I began to navigate upon the seas, which I have continued to this day. Mine is a calling that inclines those who pursue it to desire to understand the world's secrets. Such has been my interest for more than 40 years, and I have sailed all that can be sailed in our day. I have had business and conversation with learned men among both laity and clergy, Latins and Greeks, Jews and Muslims, and many others of different religions. I prayed to the most merciful Lord concerning my desire, and he gave me the spirit and the intelligence for it. He gave me abundant skill in the mariner's arts, an adequate understanding of the stars, and of geometry and arithmetic. He gave me the mental capacity and the manual skill to draft spherical maps and to draw cities, rivers, mountains, islands, and ports, all in their proper places. During this time, I have searched out and studied all kinds of texts, geographies, histories, chronologies, philosophies, and other subjects. With a hand that could be felt, the Lord opened my mind to the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies, and he opened my will to desire to accomplish the project. This was the fire that burned within me when I came to visit your highnesses. All who found out about my project denounced it with laughter and ridiculed me. All the sciences which I mentioned above were of no use to me. Quotations of learned opinions were no help. Only your majesties had faith and perseverance. Who can doubt that this fire was not merely mine, but also of the Holy Spirit, who encouraged me with a radiant illumination from his sacred holy scriptures? By a most clear and powerful testimony, from the 44 books of the Old Testament, from the 4 Gospels, from the 23 epistles of the blessed apostles, urging me to press forward. Continually, without a moment's hesitation, the scriptures urged me to press forward with great haste. End of quote from Christopher Columbus.
The preceding program was presented by Summit University, Box 5000, Livingston, Montana, 59047, 5000. If you'd like to know more, call this number or write this address. For your free copy of Elizabeth Clare Prophet's best-selling book, The Human Aura, call this toll-free number, 1-800-323-5228. This is a limited-time offer, so call now for your free book. That's 1-800-323-5228.